Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hello, I'm Jim Holcomb, President and CEO of the Michigan Chamber, and today's podcast host. We're going to be talking about an issue that may not be on your radar screen right now, but it's one that could have far-reaching impacts, and that's ozone attainment and our national ambient air quality standards. We're going to dive into what's happening and why it matters. Very pleased today to be joined by three great guests. Karll, the Manager of Environment and Infrastructure for Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. We often around town call it SEMCOG. Liethen, the Director of Environmental and Regulatory Policy for the Michigan Manufacturers Association. And the Michigan Chamber's very own Alaimo, our Director of Environmental and Energy Affairs. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, as we said, we're going to be talking about air quality attainment and something called National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Now that's a mouthful even for government.
Right.
But, Mike, maybe we can start with you. Just what is ambient air?
Right. I mean, it's a great question, and it does affect us all. Although, as you said, it's likely under the radar for most folks in Michigan. But essentially, under the Clean Air Act, the EPA regulates what's called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Essentially, it is, among other things, regulating 6 pollutants and looking at those standards in different regions throughout the country and making sure that those regions are compliant with a certain amount of those pollutants in the air. So ozone is one of them. Ground level ozone, often called smog, which forms when you have nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds that react in the presence of sunlight. So it's a lot of times these hot, humid days that we have in the kind of the dog days of summer in Michigan, where we see ozone levels spike. And back in 2015, we saw a new standard for ozone put into place by the EPA, and under that kind of redesignation, Southeast Michigan was found in marginal non-attainment. And so that kind of triggered a slew of response activity from the department, from the state environmental department, that looked at all sorts of ways that we're trying to get that level down lower and achieve compliance. In last May of 2023, the good news was that EPA did finally find that for a number of reasons we were in attainment in that region, but that was immediately met with some litigation. So it's one of those areas. It's important to businesses. It's important to our communities. We believe that the area is in attainment, but as I said, there are folks that disagree and are pursuing litigation to kind of push that point.
Caroline, do the standards change often? Is this something that people do we constantly in the across the country in our different districts? Are we always having different standards, or is it something that's usually pretty stable?
Stable over a course of maybe a decade, or perhaps not as much of a decade, but as Mike mentioned, the last time ozone standards were updated were 2015. Mm-hmm. They had been set much prior to that, and then are revisited based on the more that we know about the science. And I think it's important to note that the standards are based on they're health-based standards, so they're meant to be protective of the most sensitive populations. So when we talk about how they're set to be conservative, to protect those that might have other health conditions.
Mm-hmm. And Kelly, what would it mean if a region is found to be non-attainment? What's the next step after that? What's the fallout?
Well, if a region is designated non-attainment, like, for example, SEMCOG was designated non-attainment in 2018, that meant that the air monitors in our region, for which we have 7 air monitors that monitor ozone, were reading higher levels than that 70 parts per billion that the standard was set at in 2015. That means when we're in non-attainment, there are certain requirements that are put in place from a regulatory standpoint through the state of Michigan that can apply to any number of sources. And the sources are those that are producing volatile organic compounds, or NOx, as we say, nitrogen oxides. Those sources are often vehicles, vehicle emissions, industrial emissions, And oftentimes in the ozone world, you hear Ozone Action Day or Air Quality Alert Day. Don't fill your car up or don't mow on that day. And that's to help reduce those emissions, because those are the emissions that form in the presence of sunlight and create ozone, and that's those smog and those unhealthy air conditions. That's what it means when we're in non-attainment. So, and then moving forward in the future, there could be future regulatory requirements.
And across the country, there are different zones. Does everybody have to meet the same standard, or is it different depending where you are geographically?
Standards are the same regardless.
Everywhere they're the same?
Yep.
Okay. And now, it was good, I would assume it's very good that we were found to be in attainment, but we still had some lawsuits, Caroline. What happened there? It seemed like the Sierra Club maybe disagreed and they wanted to go to court and get a different...
Yeah, so essentially what the regulatory structure is, has EGLE, our State Department, conduct continuous monitoring and evaluate the data for whether or not it has exceeded the standard. And from there, they average the measurements over a 3-year period to determine if there have been any exceedances that would trigger a bump up, if you will, in the non-attainment standard. We were at marginal, which is the lowest level of non-attainment, and we were at risk of going up to moderate, which it would have, as Kelly had mentioned, trigger a number of regulatory requirements on the region. So what happened was EGLE determined that over a 3-year period, the region had demonstrated attainment and submitted that documentation, that data, to the EPA. Now, one thing to note is that technically speaking, on 1 hour, on one day, we did have an exceedance. And so the Clean Air Act allows us to submit a exceptional events demonstration to say that because of events outside of the region, outside of our control within that region, such as wildfire smoke coming from the west, if it weren't for those days impacting that region, we would have been able to be in an attainment. So what EGLE does is they note those days, and when they're evaluating the overall data set, they determine that on those on certain particular days, we were impacted by outside events. And for that reason, we should be able to remove those days from the overall data set. EPA agreed and allowed us to do that, which has brought us to the attainment that we are now in. Sierra Club has disagreed with our ability to use the exceptional events demonstration, even though it is written into the Clean Air Act.
It just seems like good governance. It seems like, common sense that, there's something outside the normal control, and this isn't somebody doing something. This is something that's happening in the environment around, and it should be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I would argue it's government working for you, right? It's the function that we should see from government, looking at the actual data, being specific about what occurrences took place that led to those exceedances, and then making a decision. And so obviously we disagree with the Sierra Club's point of view and their litigious behavior. And we'll see how it plays out. But I think one of the things we've seen is we're pointing to there seems to be an effort to point to either anecdotal evidence or evidence that isn't under the strict regulatory parameters of the Clean Air Act. And it's also important to remember that just because we've achieved attainment doesn't mean that the work around air quality and maintaining compliant air quality goes away, right? Federal law requires that states establish a maintenance plan, and they continue to take inventory. They make sure that those actions are permanent and enforceable. That's kind of the standard by which EPA looks at, okay, is this plan something that ensures that air quality can stay at a certain level? So, this issue remains very active, whether we're, even if, we're in attainment. This is still, an ongoing priority for the region.
When you have a situation
Oh, I'd just like to add, I think it's important for the public to put this in perspective. Back in the 90s, the ozone standard was at 80 parts per billion. And many of our monitors at that time were even higher, right? So we've really come down. The standard now is at 70, and all of our monitors are generally meeting that standard, and that's why we were redesignated to attainment. We don't have widespread air pollution. Air pollution is declined so much, and because of an isolated reading here or two, that's not a reason to put us back into non-attainment, because there'll be significant financial and economic impacts to residents of Southeast Michigan. And then just quickly, I'd like to say across, for those couple of readings that may have been higher, the whole 7 counties could be put into non-attainment, which would require a vehicle emissions and testing program. That's your tailpipe testing. Mm-hmm. And at first glance, that might include cars 5 years and older. In our region, that's probably more than 2.5 million vehicles. And likely at least half of those are in communities that are underserved. Mm-hmm. So in reality, the cost of this program will affect those least likely to be able to afford it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I'm not sure that the supporters of the lawsuit are considering that financial burden on a population that they often say they represent.
Karll, can you go a little deeper on that? Is this, when we're out of attainment, are there steps to be taken? Does it hit the the normal consumer directly? Does it more hit a business? Is it a pass-through somewhere? How do the problems result from the non-attainment?
Well, there are a number of regulatory implications that get put into place if we are designated back into non-attainment and likely moderate non-attainment. The one I just mentioned is the vehicle emissions and testing program. That's the one that will have the most direct impact on the residents of Southeast Michigan. The program will be developed by the state of Michigan and approved, and obviously that would be a few years out if we were to get bumped back into non-attainment, but it's still out there. There are a number of other programs, air pollution prevention programs going on that are offsetting a lot of, more air quality issues. But other things that happen are economic development challenges. So if a new business comes in and they need to have an air permit that's going to emit VOCs or NOx pollutants, they're going to be on hold until there's an offset somewhere else of a certain amount. So that could impact potential economic development and new business coming into Southeast Michigan. And in a state where we have a population that's being maintained, we're really trying to grow businesses and job opportunities in Southeast Michigan.
How, this probably a rudimentary question, but not as well as you three on this. How does that happen? I mean, we don't have walls at our state borders. Mm-hmm. What happens when something's drifting across? We talked about wildfires or something, and it certainly can have an impact. Is that a usual occurrence, or does it all kind of equalize out?
Yeah, so that's a major issue that we're still dealing with, particularly in Western Michigan, where there are 3 counties in non-attainment. They're actually in the moderate non-attainment that Kelly had referenced. So yes, we have major challenges when it comes to transport. Ozone does not remain static. It does move, particularly it moves for us over Lake Michigan. And so when you have the effect of these pollutants going over the water, the sun is reflecting down on them, and then the sun is going down, it's reflecting off the water, it's baking into more ozone, and then that is immediately hitting our western shore. Yeah,
so we're, again, just kind of the byproduct of what's going on around sometimes. And and I would assume technology must be advancing consistently, so it's great that our air quality is much improved from years past, but it's also, it's got to be a little hard because you can measure such minute amounts of things now that makes it hard to comply, because you can keep setting standards, what is technically feasible and what is economically realistic seem to be sometimes at counter positions, Mike.
It's an ongoing challenge, I think. I think from a regulator's standpoint, they're always trying to achieve the most conservative or restrictive standards for sake of protecting the public health. And that absolutely is a priority that we should all, keep in mind when we're talking air quality issues. But, as Kelly pointed out, and the reality very much is, there's a number of macro trends, if you will, that have led to, significant increases in our air quality over the last several decades. And one of them certainly is our grid has gotten cleaner, right? The utilization of natural gas and the electrification of our grid power is huge in making sure that there aren't as many of these contaminants being put into the air. There's also other regulatory arenas that play a role here, like around CAFE standards and ensuring that automakers and refineries are, using less sulfur to make gasoline, making more efficient vehicles, electric vehicles, et cetera. So these are some of those things that we're going to continue to benefit from over the years to come, and I think people lose sight of that sometimes.
Kelly, as we look
Jim?
at
Oh, I was just going to add on to what Mike was saying. From a local government perspective, people should know that there are numerous air quality programs in our region that directly benefit public health. And if they look to their own local governments and transportation agencies, think through, we have 2 distinct grant programs that focus on reducing emissions from cars and trucks. SEMCOG, on an annual basis, provides over $10 million on active transportation and mobility projects to support walking, biking, and pedestrian safety. As we move into those direction of alternative transportation, that has less vehicles on the roads, less vehicle miles traveled equals less emissions. In the last 2 years, we have provided over $55 million on transportation projects that address congestion. Those are projects like signal timing, roundabouts, and replacements of traditional buses with low-emission biodiesel or even electric buses. And as Mike mentioned, the cleaner grid, we're seeing a higher prevalence also of electric vehicles, which also removes those typical vehicle emissions.
And it seems like something, too, that we'll get more and more of that you have good programs like that can actually have a positive impact, just the more that people become comfortable and how to implement. You raised a good point, though. I mean, Kelly, you deal with local governments and state governments, federal. How do all those entities work together when we're talking about something like this regulatory structure? Are they cooperative or are they at odds and battling?
I would say we're all very cooperative, right? And SEMCOG, we have a membership of about close to 200 local governments, and we regularly work on many challenges. Transportation is our biggest role, and we're always seeking out more federal and state funding to support these programs. And we have the regional transportation plan, and we manage the active transportation improvement program. So we always have all of our local governments from local, county, MDOT working collaboratively on these programs.
Caroline, you mentioned earlier about the lawsuit that had been filed. What's kind of the status of that? Is it still ongoing, or how does that get resolved?
Yeah, thank you. So we are participating in amicus, and by we, there's some people on this call and others as well. The amicus will be filed in mid-April, at which point we'll have the opportunity to have supported EPA in their decision.
So this is going to be we're probably a ways out from resolution then, because as we know, the court system and people could appeal and takes time and
Correct.
Get all the facts out there.
Yep, exactly. So I think we're working together to kind of figure out what that argument is going to be. But I mean, it's going to be largely in support of the work that Eagle and the EPA did together to make sure, again, one, that the data that was used to make the decision around attainment is sound, and again, that looking at all of the other priorities and obligations surrounding the Clean Air Act are being met and followed.
Mike, just generally going forward, what do you think listeners of this podcast should know about air quality and other issues that may be coming? We're talking about this one attainment issue here, but what else is going on in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for folks to, take a broader, historical perspective when it comes to this issue. I think it's important to note that we've seen these really significant improvements in the quality of our air, and that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that we should be taking a victory lap either. I think it's, again, a top priority for public health and for our communities that we're doing everything we can to ensure that we have a good air to breathe, but at the same time ensuring a regulatory environment that allows for us to continue to invest in our region and our communities and innovate, right? And I think that's one of those things. You're seeing the innovation take place in economic engines like Southeast Michigan. And so where and when, we have, regulatory burdens preventing that from happening, that can affect everybody. That can affect all hardworking families.
Caroline and Kelly, as we get close to an end here, unfortunately, as our time goes, I'd like to get from each of you maybe your one takeaway that you want listeners to this podcast to hear. So Caroline, we'll start with you.
Yeah, just how significant really our air quality has improved since the 90s. I want to underscore, and part of the ozone levels going down is our member manufacturer investment in pollution control technology. And as they make those investments to improve air quality, I also want to underscore that is driven by also the need to continue to expand and grow. And so avoiding additional regulations moving forward is of the utmost importance as well.
Great. And Kelly, we're going to let you back clean up on this. What's the last thing that our listeners should be hearing on this topic?
I think the last thing is consistent with what Mike and Caroline have said. Air quality has been continuing to improve in our region and across the state over the last 30 years. And we know that protection of public health is of utmost importance. We're going to continue to invest in those programs that have a direct benefit on our region's air quality and public health.
Great. Well, with that, we are out of time. A very special thanks to Kelly, Caroline, and Mike, and to all of you for listening. Ozone Attainment certainly matters a lot to Michiganders. It matters to our communities and to our businesses. And we hope you'll tune in to our next episode. Subscribe or like our podcast for easy notifications. And until then, any information you need on important issues in Michigan, you can always find it at michamber.com.